Hello, my name is Matthew, and we've started our read along for Boswell's The Life of Johnson. And this week, I've read the first 250 pages, and actually, I took some notes just to help me not forget anything. And I'm really happy so far. James Boswell is just really good company. He's a very companionable writer. And one of the few things that I knew about this book going in before I started it was that Boswell liked to insert himself into the story. And as I was reading it, I started noticing something. It was almost as if the voice was familiar. And very early on, I was able to kind of pinpoint what I was feeling. And what I realized is that Boswell is Watson and Samuel Johnson is Sherlock. And as soon as that occurred to me, I had such an easier time understanding their relationship. In the Sherlock stories, Watson admires Sherlock. He respects him, but very importantly, he doesn't idolize or worship him. So if Samuel Johnson does something or says something that Boswell disagrees with, he doesn't just accept it as this is his hero and he can do no wrong, but instead he's actually disappointed. And I brought this up to Steve Donahue. Steve and I are doing the read along together. I should have said that first. I brought that up to Steve Donahue, and Steve pointed out that that was actually a part of the Sherlock stories. Conan Doyle was very aware of that fact, and in the Adventure of the Scandal in Bohemia, which I read earlier this week because of my conversation with Steve, not only does it mention the famous Irene Adler, but there's a moment where Sherlock says to Watson, like, come on, we're going on our adventure. And Watson says, well, I think I'll just hang back. I don't think I'm going to go. And Sherlock says, but you're nothing. Sherlock says, but I'm lost without my Boswell. So there's an explicit reference to the life of Samuel Johnson in the Sherlock story, which is really interesting. The beginning of the biography is sort of a reportage of Dr. Johnson's childhood and formative years. And what we get is this picture of the most ultimate precocious child and young man. Everything that he did was amazing and brilliant, and he was just this genius that soaked up knowledge and read extensively and could write almost effortlessly, and he could do no wrong. And as far as all of the things that Johnson wrote during this time, it was just such a relief or a huge benefit that Boswell actually includes as much textual material as he can. So there's excerpts from translations and poems and letters and different things that Dr. Johnson actually wrote. And for someone that knows nothing about him, everything that I'm learning is in the book. It just helps me to understand what kind of a writer, what he's actually writing. And I think it was a stroke of genius on Boswell's part, because when this was written, everyone already knew Dr. Johnson. He was like the revered Dr. Johnson. So it's information that at the time probably didn't have to be included, but as far as posterity, it's such a crucial aspect to the enjoyment of the book and getting an understanding of who Dr. Johnson really was. Um, and there's something strange about how how Dr. Johnson is being perceived in these moments. There's kind of a tinge of eulogizing. This was written just after Dr. Johnson had died, and there could be that kind of golden glow of nostalgia and looking back and seeing this great man. And I think that's part of it. But there's a disconnect, because when Dr. Johnson goes into the real world, he's no longer taken for granted to be the most brilliant mind that's ever lived. Instead, he's looking for work. He's kind of hustling around and trying to get in magazines and papers and publishing things. So it wasn't this red carpet that was rolled out for him. And the implication there is that at the time, in the publishing industry, he wasn't considered as monumentally brilliant as he's being portrayed in the earlier part of the text. Around this time is when the dictionary comes up. So this is one of the things that I knew about Dr. Johnson, is that he wrote the Dictionary of the English Language, and it was this huge endeavor to try to write the first English dictionary and collect and come up with a standardized version of what all of the words mean. And I think it's a very curious project to me, as far as why he would want to go and do this. There's a great interaction where somebody says something along the lines of, like, well, this is absurd, this is crazy, this is such a huge project. In France, they had a whole panel of people. There were 40 Frenchmen who had to work together for years and years and years to come up with the French dictionary. And Dr. Johnson, you're trying to do all of this all by yourself. And Johnson has some sort of quip where he says, 40 Frenchmen versus 1 Englishman. I would consider that an even fight, or something like that. And even upon publication of this thing, it's evident that it was popular, it was well respected, not universally, there were exceptions, but this was a big deal, and he managed to put this thing out. And the odd thing to me is, I don't really understand how this couldn't have set him for life financially. It seems to me that if you write the first dictionary, a book that would presumably be in every single literate man's, person's house, that you've must have hit some sort of status that would allow you to have creative endeavors for the rest of your life. But instead, even though it was popular, he's still this kind of working writer. He's writing prefaces for other books and dedications. He's writing essays, and even though he doesn't seem as if he's destitute or anything like that, he's certainly well off, but you get the feeling that he's still looking for work. So something happened there that I don't quite understand. And he starts a magazine. It's called The Rambler. And it's around this time that I started noticing how important and influential Horace must have been to Dr. Johnson. And I was also lucky enough to, just by coincidence in some ways, to read The Art of Poetry by Horace just this week as well. And there's these recurrences in the life of Samuel Johnson that just match up, where I can tell that Dr. Johnson is thinking about Horace. There's repeated phrases that the idea of literature is meant to delight and instruct. That keeps coming up. And I haven't read anything in the Rambler. I have the writings of Samuel Johnson, and they're all in there. And I have a speculation that when I get to it, and I plan on reading it fairly shortly, maybe after I finish the biography, I'm going to try to read the Rambler essays with Horace's poetry, like read them side by side. And my prediction is that there are going to be similarities. Horace's poetry were these views of everyday life in ancient Rome, but also a depiction of the moral landscape at the time. And I feel like that's going to be very similar to what Dr. Johnson is trying to do in his Rambler essays. I could be wrong about that, but that's what I think. And the other thing that I noticed was, for my very small pile of information that I have, I started thinking that Dr. Johnson's life up until this point reminds me so much of the life of Samuel Taylor Coleridge. They've had similar educations, they have similar interests, both known to be these brilliant minds and brilliant talkers and men of letters, could write on any subject, both polymaths, both multilingual. They both suffered from depression and mental illness. Coleridge turned to drug use. Dr. Johnson was a drinker. I get the feeling that they both had issues with idling, long stretches of time when they just really weren't doing anything productive, maybe a lot of reading. And I get also the tendency to have unfinished projects, to start things that don't go anywhere. There, in the life of Johnson, something that keeps coming up is this book on Shakespeare that he's writing. And it sounds as if he's either procrastinating or afraid to touch it. I went and read all the portions in Coleridge's work where he mentions Dr. Johnson, and it was very suspect how few times Johnson is mentioned, and also how dismissive Coleridge is of him. For someone that had so many similar interests, and they're both around at the same time, Coleridge was younger. It was very curious to me that Coleridge himself did not have any sort of reverential attitude or tone towards Johnson. So then, about 200 pages in, there's a big moment in the book. And it's the moment that Dr. Johnson appears. So up until this point, it's been reportage. We've been hearing about Dr. Johnson, hearing about what he's doing and what he's writing. But there's a moment in James Boswell's life where we find early on that James Boswell is just a fan of Dr. Johnson. He's been reading his works and reading them in magazines, and he knows who he is. And Dr. Johnson is like a celebrity, and he wants to meet him. Boswell wants to meet him. And so the book changes its tone And it's like this big breakaway moment where Dr. Johnson walks into the room, and now the man himself is there. And it reminded me, this whole progression up until a climactic moment reminded me of the first episode of The West Wing, which I only just started watching for the first time this week as well. And in The West Wing, the whole episode is about the White House staff. It's all behind the scenes. And we meet all of these characters doing all sorts of things, and there's big problems and crises, and everything's going on. And the center of attention, the thing that's at the forefront of everybody's mind, is the president. But throughout the episode, the president is noticeably absent until the climactic conclusion of the show, where there's a meeting, and it's a very tense meeting, and the White House staff and these other people don't know what's going to happen. And then the doors fly open, and Martin Sheen, the president, walks in, and he chews up the scenery and has this great scene. And it's the moment in the show where I realized, like, this is going to be good. This was pretty cool. It's the same thing in the Life of Samuel Johnson. He shows up. It's great. And what I learn immediately is that he's rude. Very politely, like, one of the things that keeps coming up until this point was that he was sort of rough around the edges. Kind of dressed like a slob. He had a wig that didn't fit. He had his shoes unbuckled, stockings that were baggy, and lines in his hosiery, and all these kinds of things. So you almost this sense of, like, maybe he's not pretentious. And the moment that Johnson and Boswell meet, the first thing that Johnson does is chastises Boswell for basically for even opening his mouth before they're actually acquainted. And it could be like the social etiquette of the time, but to me it's critical that for their relationship, Boswell basically grovels, and he feels bad that Johnson had to set him straight. And the more that you learn, the more time you spend with Dr. Johnson, the more you realize, like, this guy might be a bear to be around. And I think one of the reasons that Johnson took such a liking to Boswell is because Boswell would take it. Boswell started their relationship as a fan. He wanted to meet him. And as it goes along, he has all of these opinions about, if you ask Johnson about anything, he has a whole opinion. And he has such a high self-importance of his own judgment that he makes declarative statements. This is how it is. This is how it is. And it gets to the point where Johnson, to Boswell, they're friends now. Johnson will just casually, freely correct the things that Boswell was saying. So Boswell will say something, and Johnson will go, "You shouldn't use that word. That's the wrong way to say this or that." And it's a great way of showing a whole personality of a man. We get like the perceived public view. We get how very close friends perceive him, and it moves on from there until we meet him. And he's not a different person. He's a more complicated person, and it's a different perspective. It's as if he is now facing us full front instead of a profile shot or something like that. And it kind of made me think about his dictionary, because at the time I thought, why is he writing this thing? Why bother? And this is the kind of guy that probably got so sick of having to constantly correct people's language that he like sat down and said, "You know what? I'm just gonna write the whole thing out." And that's kind of what I have. This is running a little bit long. It's wholly enjoyable. I'm really looking forward to continuing it. I'm still enthusiastic and excited about the project. Um, Still quite a ways to go, and we've already covered basically my entire knowledge of Johnson. I knew, I knew that he wrote a dictionary. I knew that he had something called the Rambler. I should mention Coleridge also had his own little magazine called The Friend, so that's another similarity. So I don't know what's going to go on from here. I don't know. I have no idea what the rest of the book is going to be, which is fine with me. So if you are reading along, I would love to hear what your experiences are, different thoughts that you might have. Leave them in the comments if you would like. If you're someone that makes videos, I would love to watch your video. And I think I'm pretty positive that Steve Donahue will be making a video today as well, or maybe the next day or two. I don't know. But yeah, I'm really pleased. So leave a comment if you would like, and thank you for watching.